Welcome back, everybody. And we've had a terrific first section this morning, and I'm looking forward to the second part, which is all about new treatments and clinical trials. My name's Helen Turner, and I'm an endocrinologist who is also involved in the thyroid eye disease multidisciplinary clinic in Oxford. And it's a real pleasure to have such a great group of speakers for the second half here. It's a pleasure to introduce this section, and I've been involved with, as I said, the TED MDT, as well as being involved in the Thyroid Eye Disease Charitable Trust. And I'm also working with TMED, which some of you may be aware of, which is aiming to really improve outcomes and raise awareness of thyroid eye disease to try and reduce its occurrence, or else at least improve urgent treatment where required and optimizing management. But I think what's really interesting is that doing the clinic and also listening to the first half of this session is clearly the urgent need for newer treatments and all the different aspects which perhaps we're not addressing in an optimal fashion nowadays. And also that every patient, as we're hearing in the chat, but also in the presentations, every patient is different. And so I think we're now really beginning to see the benefit of research into mechanisms and understanding of thyroid eye disease with some of these newer targeted therapies that are coming through. So this session, I think, is super exciting. It's going to discuss ongoing studies of new therapies, but also will enable us to hear from a patient who's actually been through one of the studies and kind of some of the things that people might want to discuss, ask her, and think about if considering that. And it's clearly important because having looked at some of the questions that have been coming in during the presentation today, but also some of the questions that you submitted beforehand, the sorts of things you were asking in the questionnaire before were things like, what are the progression, what is the progress in new treatments, what about insights into new treatment, what about biologics and trials, what are the new up-to-date treatments? So it's clearly something appropriate that's on all of your minds. So in order to optimise efficacy and patient acceptability and improve quality life, but considering side effects, clinical trials are clearly really important. So it's a real pleasure to introduce the first speaker this afternoon, who many of you will know, Professor Colin Diane. He trained in London in endocrinology, and then has spent most of his life looking at the immunology of Graves' disease, both in the UK and then in America. Moved to Cardiff, where he's the chair of clinical diabetes and metabolism. But he's really well known for all his publications within the field of thyroid eye disease. He's the UK lead for TMED and has really driven that national drive to improve outcomes, is heavily involved with UGOGO, and he's also a trustee and huge supporter of the Thyroid Eye Disease Charitable Trust. So without further ado, Colin, we'd love to hear you speaking about new treatments and how they work. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen. That's a very nice introduction. Okay, right, let me just share my screen, hopefully. How does that look? I'll just put it on presenter mode. Is that sharing okay? So thank you. Yes, there's a lot of excitement in this area, as a lot of you have picked up. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit techie. I'll try and keep it away from being techie, but we've got time to put your questions in the chat and answer them later on. I just wanted to begin a little bit with saying, building on what Simon Pierce said earlier on where we are and why we need more treatments. Now, this might be fairly obvious to you, but not everybody gets it. Just to remind you of this classification we have of TED or Graves' orbitopathy, GO, mild, moderate, and severe. And what I'll be talking about is treatments really that are focusing on the moderate to severe area over here.
Finale.
Okay. So only in 2021 did the European Group on Graves' orbitopathy produce some guidelines, which didn't really include any new treatments. They were focusing on, if you can read any of this, methylprednisolone as the main treatment for moderate to severe, not for mild disease, but for moderate to severe. And they said possibly you could look at some second-line treatments further down the line. So these new treatments are really something very much in the last few years, and one of them is coming very close to being available. But in the context of what we call the unmet need, what is that needs to happen? I just wanted to show you some data from a trial we conducted some time ago, which looked at the combination of steroids and radiotherapy and an immunosuppression with azathioprine. So many of you may have had some of those treatments. And you will probably be aware, and some of you fill these in, of the Graves' orbitopathy quality of life measures. And I'm showing you these because I'm going to show you what happened in the trial in terms of what people felt, not just measures of from what the doctors are measuring, but what did they actually feel. And we do it on two subscales. There's questions about the visual function, how do your eyes work, but also the appearance of the eyes, which clearly is very important. It was originally developed in Holland, which is why they talk about cycling, which may not be quite so relevant to the UK, but you get scores down all of these. So now what I'm showing you here is the people in the study, and on this side was their score when they started, and unusually we follow people right out to 3 years. So each is a person, and high is good and low is bad. So a low score means you've got a lot of problems, and 100% means you're absolutely fantastic. So if you like, this person had no problems with their visual function and was fine at the end. So what you can see is that mostly the lines go up. In other words, people's function does get better. But in particular, in terms of their visual appearance, it's not quite such a good pattern. And there's lots of people over here who've got lots of problems even 3 years later. Not many people are up at that 100 mark over here. And even in terms of the functioning, which is things like double vision, even here, there's a lot of people who are still struggling even 3 years later. I'm sure I'm telling you things you already know, but it's important to see it in terms of data. So that's why we've got to improve on what we've got. And they all got steroids, and some of them got radiotherapy as well. Okay, you heard earlier on about surgery, and surgery is still great. And in the end, we found that 37% of the people who had medical therapy ended up having some surgery as well over that 3-year period. And not many people know that number of over a third of people ending up, despite the medical treatments, still needing surgery at the end of the day. Most of that was lid surgery or decompression, but a little bit of squint surgery there as well. And the surgery does work, right? So you can see here the same kind of scores, and now looking at the change in the here on this side is surgery, and almost all those lines go up following the surgery. The people who had surgery generally ended up in a much better place than the people who had medical interventions over here. But obviously surgery is surgery. That's a lot of extra things to happen. And as you heard earlier on from Vicky, generally we wait quite a long time before we do the surgery because we want the eyes to be stable. But overall, that's what that means is that people are sitting with problems with their eyes for many years before it gets fixed. So we really want to accelerate that and get people into a better space more quickly. Right, so now said it might be a little bit techie. So we just need to go back into how thyroid eye disease happens. So up here is a scan. This is a CT scan, and it's like a horizontal scan through someone's head. So this is their brain over here. Just moving things around on my screen so I can see it properly. This is their brain back here. These are the eyes. So these things here are the eye muscles. I don't know if you can see my pointer. Can people see the pointer? Yeah. These are the eye muscles here with little dots, and they're way fatter than they should be. That should be what an eye muscle should look like. These are really fat eye muscles, and they're pushing the eye forward. And this is the process of thyroid eye disease. And in here, there's also a lot of fat tissue that has also expanded to push the eye muscle forward. So at the core to this are these little cells called fibroblasts, and they sit behind the eye and they cushion the eye, but they can develop into fat, so-called adipogenesis. But if they do that, they get bigger and they swell, and that's part of the expansion here. They can also release substances down here that can cause the eye muscles to swell here. These substances cause swelling. So why would these little cells behind the eye do any of this? And what we believe it's to do with these antibodies which are directed normally at the thyroid in Graves' disease, and they cause the thyroid to be overactive, but they seem to also stick onto and activate these fibroblasts behind the eye. Oddly enough, it seems there's another set of molecules called IGF-1 that also work on the fibroblasts. Now, IGF-1, probably not IGF-1 antibodies, despite what it says here, is always present in your circulation, and it promotes growth of cells generally, so it's a good thing. But it seems that the combination of these two things drives these cells to go a bit crazy, cause fat, and cause sticky substances that cause the eye muscles to swell. Well, okay, so where do the antibodies come from? And the antibodies come from white cells in the blood, from particularly cells called B cells. And they also make molecules called cytokines that add to all this process over here. So there's lots of targets we can head for. We can look at the IGF-1, we can look at the antibodies, we can look at the cytokines here, these things in inflammation that also add to this, this process in the fibroblasts. And there are now people addressing all these different parts in the process. Okay, so this is a little map here of what we can aim for. That's my fibroblast over there that's going to cause swelling and fat. This is the receptor for these little green things are your thyroid stimulating antibodies, the ones that are going to switch your thyroid on over here. Here they are switching the thyroid on. The same molecule, the TSH receptor, is also present in the fat cells, so they'll come and switch the eye fibroblasts on as well. And I'm also showing you some other cells here. B cells make the antibodies in the first place after converting into plasma cells over here. This is the IGF-1 system over there. So here's a little list of all things that we could intervene in. And in fact, people have hit all of these targets currently. So I'm going to show you some examples of that. So the first and the best known was this antibody. It's an antibody as a treatment, not an antibody in your blood, that is here. It's on the, to block the IGF-1 receptor. So IGF-1 in the circulation can't work and can't act on these cells. Interesting enough, this antibody was developed for cancer, but didn't work very well as a treatment for cancer. So they kind of threw it in the bin, but it sat around and then it was picked up again by Terry Smith's group, who tried it out for thyroid eye disease. And the results were, I think people would generally say, astonishing. So this is some of the early trials over here. And what are we looking at here, for example? I'll just move this out of the way over here. So I want you to particularly look at the top left hand over here. So this is proptosis, which means the degree to which the eyes are sticky out. And with no treatment, and actually it's the same with steroids, very few people see a response. Whereas with the teprotumumab, this new treatment here, within 6 weeks, 56 people had shown improvement, and 83% showed improvement within 24 weeks. So that's quite a quick response. And this actually is how much they changed on the top right here, the number of millimeters. So this is with no treatment here, they didn't change very much. But here's the number of millimeters of sticky outness of the eyes that reduce. So up to about 3 millimeters, which doesn't seem a lot, but it is a huge amount and making a difference to how your eyes are protruding forwards. And also, this is the activity score, how angry the eyes are, and some evidence, oops, sorry, go back again, here on the diplopia. So this is the double vision over here. So how many people got improvement in their double vision? And the answer was about 68% of them got an improvement versus 29%. And then down here, and this is really important, that's the quality of life score. And for the first time, we saw an improvement in the quality of life score that you saw at those questions, cycling and so on, compared to no treatment. So that was this drug. It's also been tried in people who've had, what I was showing you there is people who had new eye disease. It was just starting within a few months of the diagnosis. But they have more recently tried it in people who've actually got proptosis for a long time. So the eyes are moved forward, and it can persist, as you know, for many years. And they tried it in these people who had disease for I think, more than 3 years. And what you're seeing here is the green is the number of millimeters reduced versus the gray, which was on no treatment. So the reduction was less. It was about 2 and a bit millimeters, not the 3.5 that we saw when in the new disease, but still remarkable that it was doing something even many years afterwards. And these are kind of some pictures from that study. So this is somebody before treatment, and this is when they were given just the dummy, no treatment at all. And this is somebody before treatment, and then here they are 24 weeks after treatment. Now, obviously, they show the best pictures because that's what people do, but it's good to see that remarkable change in just 6 months, which you wouldn't see with steroids. You might see some of the swelling go down, but not this proptosis going down, this protrusion. And here's the CT scans. These are big, thick eye muscles, these white ones, and they're becoming less, they're still there, but they're less thick when you look at them after 24 weeks of the treatment. So that's the drug. Now, there's no free lunch, as you know, so any treatment is going to have side effects. But it's important to remember that steroids, which is the standard treatment that we have now, has side effects too. So we've got to bear that in mind. So these are the main list of side effects. And you look at it like when you read the label inside of, paracetamol, you think, oh God, I'm not going to take that. Look at all those things that could happen, liver failure and so on. But you've got to be practical about it. And very few people discontinued the treatment because of the side effects. They said, well, I feel my benefits are better than the side effects. Where we focus a little bit are, it can induce diabetes or high blood sugars, as can steroids actually. But that tends to settle after the treatment. And this is where people are focused a bit, is a loss of hearing. And that maybe is not clear, maybe up to 10% of people. In some people, it's reversible. In some people, it doesn't seem to be reversible. So it's definitely something that we have to monitor. And muscle spasms is also something that people often describe, but again, it gets better when you stop the treatment. Okay, so this treatment called teprotumumab or Tepezza, as I think Simon referred to earlier on the 7th of May 2025, was approved by the UK Medicines Authority. Does that mean you can use it? No. Well, you can go and buy it tomorrow, actually, and someone can prescribe it. But the NHS has not agreed to pay for it as yet, and it's currently going through the process by which the NICE process, where they assess whether they're willing to pay for it. How much does it cost? Well, we never really find out how much these drugs really cost to the NHS, but I'm going to talk about money for a minute because it's very important in this context. This is the money I'm going to talk about. So the company that started that drug, which was called Horizon, was then, because of the results of that trial, which were very exciting, was bought out by a bigger company called Amgen for $27.8 billion. That's a massive amount of money. And these are the only 3 drugs they had when they bought that company: a drug for gout, a drug for a very rare eye disease, and this one, Tepezza. Why am I talking about this? Because this sale meant that the market companies now feel that it is worth investing in thyroid eye disease. That's what's caused the enormous expansion in new drugs, because there's gold in their hills. I mean, we've got to come down to money at the end of the day. In the US, the drug costs over $250,000 for a course, so it's not cheap. How much it will cost in the UK will be quite a bit less, but it's certainly not going to be, it's going to be much more expensive than steroids. So we have to bear these things in mind. However, this drug has triggered a lot of activity that there'd never been in our disease, in Graves' disease. So another one here, just there, I'm just going to show you a couple more. So down here, you can get a tablet that doesn't block the receptor for the IGF, but stops it working. And that's currently in clinical trial. So that's a tablet rather than an antibody, but it's working on the same system. If we move over and say, well, let's forget about this IGF system. What about those TRAB antibodies, those stimulating antibodies? That's what I care about. So we've got to go to the B cells, the white blood cells that are making them, to try and see what we can do about that. So a treatment that's been around for over 30 years is called rituximab. Here's a little vial of it here. It's given as an infusion, and it was used for blood cancer to begin with, for lymphoma because of B cells becoming cancerous. But you can use a much lower dose in thyroid eye disease. In fact, Mario Salvi has shown you can give it as a single infusion. So these are people given a single infusion of rituximab over about half an hour or so, can be a little bit longer. This is their inflammation score, and you can see it's gradually coming down, which is usually a good sign here. And this is when they were just given steroids. So the steroids did the same, but they wore off after 12 weeks, whereas the single treatment with rituximab seems to have persisted. And you can see that it also, because I said it was against, this is a drug against the B cells that make antibodies, there was a reduction in the antibodies, these are the level of antibodies, in those given the rituximab versus the steroids, but it wasn't down to zero, and these antibodies do gradually disappear over time. What this didn't do very much to is the proptosis and the double vision. That didn't improve, not like the one that we saw before. Most recently, and I'm going to take a minute to explain what these are, if you like all these techie things, called FcRn inhibitors. What that means is that antibodies, these are again antibodies in your blood, every day they get taken up by the cells lining the blood, the endothelial cells, they line your blood vessels, and they take them up and then destroy them so that new ones can be made. That's a part of the process. But to make sure not too many of the antibodies are destroyed, there is a way by which they attach to this little green receptor here, and they stay away from this purple blob. The purple blob is acid inside the cell that can destroy the antibodies. So by keeping them in here, they don't get destroyed as much. So this drug, what it does is it blocks the green docking station here. That means the poor old antibodies have to go into the acid part of the cell where they get destroyed. So it's a way of turning over the antibodies. So what happens when you give these drugs is you reduce new antibodies that are being formed. And that's how it's not specific for the thyroid antibodies, but it reduces antibodies. And this is what's shown here in a recent study of this. Now, what it's showing you is that this is the level of all antibodies, and you can see they drop during the treatment. This is the line, gray line is without any treatment. These are the thyroid antibodies, and they drop as well. And these are the thyroid stimulant antibodies, and they drop as well. So in reducing the antibodies, they don't reduce it to the level where you can't protect against infections, but it is the first way that we can see now of dropping those stimulatory antibodies. Well, we now have, I mentioned that everyone's in on this game now, and this is a list of clinical trials, right, that's going on, and it's actually a longer list than this, showing you some of the ones I talked about, anti-FcRn, the examples here, IGF-1, we've talked about that a little bit here, different ways of approaching that. There are also other treatments that are used for cytokines, those chemicals that are released, or other ways of targeting the B cells. So I mentioned about who pays. I just want to finish with this. So who pays? Well, not us normally, but it's the NHS. And that means NICE, who have to review these things. And so that first drug, Tepezza, is in the stage of going to NICE. And they said first around they weren't going to accept it, but they're looking at it again. And often in those contexts, they talk about the cost effectiveness. The fact that the regulator has said it works and it's safe, that's there. They have to say, is it worth buying? Is it worth paying for? And in that context, quite a few of you, I think, have filled in this questionnaire called EQ5D, which is a quality of life questionnaire. It's not thyroid specific. It's about general quality of life. But this body NICE looks very closely at this because it tries to compare different treatments. It talks about, if we compare treatment for cancer or for heart disease or for arthritis, which one is more valuable? And this was just some of the responses that you sent in, 57 responses here. So blue means you're fine, you don't have any problems, and this is usual activities. And then as you go around, purple means you're very highly affected. And that's for usual activities. This was for pain. The number of people reporting some pain. In fact, most of you are reporting some pain. Moderate pain was in the orange. And importantly, anxiety and depression here, and only 14% of the people applied said they're not anxious or depressed. This is important information to capture in convincing the authorities to begin to license drugs for thyroid eye disease, because it's not going to happen just on terms of people's visual function. So in summary, there's now a new generation of highly effective drugs, we think, for TED being introduced, which are likely to replace steroids and potentially surgery as well. Some of these drugs will also treat the Graves' disease, because if you treat the antibodies, then it'll treat the overactivity of the thyroid as well as the TED. There's at least 10 different mechanisms that people are trying to target, and they offer all patients. We should encourage people who do have moderate or severe thyroid eye disease to take part in clinical trials, because that's the quickest way these drugs are going to get licensed, and we'll understand their effectiveness, and encourage the NHS to adopt these new treatments.
Thank you very much, Colin. That was terrific. It's really helpful to try and understand the complex pathways and therefore why some of the newer drugs are coming along, but also to get a bit of an insight into the financial aspects and also the regulatory parts of this, because it's all important. And then finally discussing those useful, the quality of life aspects and how that's, really, really crucial in terms of considering for our patients, not just the actual visual function. So many thanks indeed. We'll have questions at the end if we may, and we'll move on to our second speaker this morning. And it's you've already heard from Vicky Lee, but again, it's a pleasure for those who've joined us later. Perhaps I will just remind everyone that she's a consultant ophthalmic and oculoplastic surgeon at Imperial. She's the national head for thyroid eye disease in the British Oculoplastic Surgery Society. She's very involved with the forthcoming meeting that we've all heard about thyroid eye disease for medical staff. And she's published extensively within general thyroid eye disease, but involved in many clinical trials for some of these novel treatments. So, Vicky, it's a great pleasure to invite you to speak today on clinical trials versus the conventional treatments. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And again, I'll reiterate Colin's exhortation that if all audience members can fill in those forms, it will form a very strong case to make to NICE. So please do. They will be coming in your feedback. So these are my declaration of interest, and one of my declaration of interests is that I'm the principal investigator and chief investigator, UK investigator in quite a lot of these trials which are going on. So when we treat TED, what are we trying to achieve? Of course, we're trying to make sure that patients don't lose vision or improve their vision. We're trying to improve patients' double vision. But at the end of the day, we're trying to improve your quality of life, okay? So we can see how much things measure up against what we have to offer currently. So you've heard quite a lot that our repertoire for treatment is quite limited. We follow the UGOGO guidelines because that's the best practice evidence, but a lot of our patients are still not happy at the end of these treatments, and they are only available for patients in a very, very small group with significant active disease, with significant moderate to severe or sight-threatening disease. So a lot of patients are labeled as mild, not because it's mild to you, it's just because us clinicians have nothing to offer apart from selenium, eye drops, and dietary advice. So there's a huge need for developing better treatments. As I mentioned, the journey of TED is very, very long. And what I see clinical trials being is quite a good thing to try while a patient is on that long journey. So I would urge all patients to consider this option. So I'm going to go through the different phases of clinical trials. And clinical trials are very, very highly regulated, and they go through several phases. And I'm trying to sort of demystify some of these different phases because there's a lot of jargon involved. So there is before it ever actually is tried on any patient, there is phase 0, which is developing of the drug in the laboratory. So a drug can be newly developed or it can be repurposed. And teprotumumab, the drug from the USA, actually repurposed from a cancer drug to a thyroid eye drug, so they can be taken off the shelf and then they can go into trial. So for newly developed drugs, there's something called a phase 1 study. These are very small studies, and it's just to make sure it's safe and to find out the dose. There are not many phase 1 thyroid eye trials currently running, but there are some on the horizon because of this explosion of interest in industry for this condition. So a lot of the trials that we can offer are generally phase 2, which are larger groups are trying to actually see whether the drug works. And in many of these trials, there will be a placebo or dummy arm, and there will be a trial drug arm. And me as an investigator will have no idea. We're not supposed to know what patients are having. I have no influence about who gets what. Then if the phase 2 trials are promising, then the drug companies will be able to raise money to run larger trials, which are involving larger groups, and generally is to confirm that it actually still works and then monitor the side effects. And sometimes they can be compared to standard treatments of the drug. So in phase 2 and phase 3 trials, you'll come across something called an open label extension in some of the trials, and it's worthwhile asking. So what happens is that when you go into a trial, you get randomized, and then we compute it into a computer, and then those drugs are prepared, and some groups of patients will have the active drug, and some patients will have placebo, even though some in the late phase 3 trials there can be 2 groups that actually everybody's being dosed, but at different doses because they're trying to find the correct dose. So it's useful to understand how the drug trial is designed. However, when there is a primary endpoint, and generally in thyroid eye trials, generally around 6-month mark, for patients who are not responding, and that could be with patients where either the drug has not worked or they have been having placebo, we don't know, they are actually offered an open label extension that everybody gets the real drug for another treatment period, and then everybody knows that they're having the open label extension. And what they're trying to, for the drug sponsor, they're trying to see whether if it still works in patients who are a bit later in the disease process, or whether patients actually need a higher dose of the drug. So that's an open label extension to demystify things. And then there's a phase 4 trials, and these are drugs which have generally been marketed or approved for use. They just want to make sure it's safe, and they want to look at the rarer side effects and how it works in different people. So there are some phase 4 trials, but not many. So how is a randomized control trial designed? So it's very strictly regulated. It has to be approved by the MHRA, which is the regulatory body in the UK. All the investigators follow what we call good clinical practice, which is a very designated training which is offered by the MHRA to make sure that we conduct the trials properly. And all the trials go through an ethics committee to make sure that the ethics are sound. So there are generally 2 groups of investigators which are involved in any clinical trial. There is the masked group, sometimes they call it the blinded group, which is not good to use in eye trials, so we tend to use the word masked. And I will be a masked, as an principal investigator, I'm masked. And the trial coordinator who handles the day-to-day running of the trial, and everybody patients get into contact with are all masked. We are not supposed to know what you're having, okay? And behind the scenes, there is the unmasked group, which is generally the pharmacy who produces the drug. And sometimes if the drug needs to be prepared before use, there will be a group of nursing or medical teams who are actually, they know what you're having, but you will never meet them. And we are not supposed to talk to them either. So it's a very segregated trial so that the mask is not broken. So if you are thinking about going into a clinical trial, it's really important that you understand these things. And I would just put some pointers in. You need to understand why the trial is being run. You will have a very long participant information leaflet. And generally, you need to ask what phase the trial is in. And do you know whether it's masked, randomized? Does it have a placebo arm? The information sheet, the patient information sheet, will generally have an informed consent together with it. And you need to look carefully, and you need to understand the potential risks, side effects, and benefits. And you need to have the opportunity to ask questions. So there generally won't be time in the busy thyroid eye clinic to answer all the questions. So if you get recruited to one of my trials, I normally will call you, or one of my other co-investigators will call you to go through it in advance so that you understand what the trial involves before we actually invite you for screening, and we go through and explain everything. But it needs to be outside the clinic setting generally because of the pressures on the NHS. And the answer is that you can withdraw at any stage, and it doesn't impact your standard treatment. Okay, so at any stage you're not happy with the trial, you're free to withdraw. It's completely voluntary, and every time you come up for every trial visit, we'll ask you, are you still happy to continue? So, of course, there is, there are very often, the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So, inclusion criteria means that you have to have those to be included in the trial. Exclusion criteria is that you mustn't have any of these to be included in the trial. So, it's very, very important you tell your investigator everything regarding your health, and then, we invite patients for screening after to just check that you are eligible. You also need to think about how long the trial lasts, okay, and it will be, and how many visits it involves, and how often you need to come up to the site, and the time commitment, including the travel, because that's quite considerable, and whether your work is happy to allow you. I mean, in practice, I found that most patients' workplace has been very supportive. So and how you're being monitored, and who to contact if you have an issue with doing the trial. And even if you fall over and sort of graze your knee, we need to know about it when you sign the consent form. So every little thing, no detail is too small in the trial. Even if you hit your head against the wall, we need to know that. Okay, so you should not be out of pocket going into these trials. So they don't pay to be involved in it. You pay a patient to be involved in the trial, but they cover all reasonable expenses. And I've had patients joining my trials from Northern Ireland, and the sponsors paid for all their flights and hotel stay, as to cover that. So, and so you need to ask about that, and you need to ask how your data and samples will be stored, and that will all be detailed in the patient information sheet and confidentiality. And then you need to have the contacts. So as Colin has alluded to, these are all the trials that are running in or have run in the UK. They're not active because they open and close at different times, and it's completely voluntary. Remember, it's a good time think about it as an alternative to medical therapy, or before you're waiting for surgery. And again, it depends on the design of the trial, but I think it generally fits in quite nicely along the long journey, and may actually benefit, and you may not need to go ahead with surgery or go back to standard medical therapy. The good thing about clinical trials is that it gives you access to cutting edge therapy at no cost to you. It's critical for medical advances, and I'm very, very grateful for all my patients who participated in clinical trials, and to all trial patients in general. There is still quite a lot of there's still a gap between real life and clinical trials, but we're trying to bridge that. For me, if you are interested in learning more about trials at my center, this is the email that you can email and to ask about any suitable clinical trials. And at that stage, I'm going to sign off. Thank you, Helen. I'm going to try stop sharing.
Thank you very much indeed, Vicky. That was so helpful. I think for all of us, just to understand the importance of clinical trials, but also to go through some of all that jargon, which I know is really confusing, and things like what are the different phases, open label, placebo, masked, and I liked your pictures there. But also to go through the process that patients should be aware of, not only consent, but also, that you can leave a study and it doesn't affect your medical treatment, and the other considerations to take in, and we may be discussing all of this later. But Vicky, I'm going to go on now to our last speaker in this session, because I think then we'll go through some of the questions after that. And so it's a real pleasure to have Yvonne Alexander with us today. And Yvonne is actually a patient with thyroid eye disease. She also has a very successful career, as many of our patients do, and we need to remember that when we're treating this condition. But Yvonne is a patient with thyroid eye disease, which was diagnosed with, it became quite severe, and she joined a clinical trial a couple of years ago now. And we're really grateful for her to share her experiences of taking part in a clinical trial today. So many thanks. And as I understand, it's going to be a partnership, Vicky, between you and Yvonne today.
Thank you, Helen. Oh, sorry. I was going to stop share this, and I was going to select my other talk because we put all the questions. Sorry, I'm really sorry. I don't know why. Let me just close this presentation. Bear with me. Stop sharing. Sorry. Great. I would share again. Hopefully that's okay. I think that's the one. So continue to share. Fine. So Yvonne, thank you again for joining us. So I've put these questions on there, so I'm going to speak them out as well. So what led you to want to take part in the clinical trial, and what were your initial thoughts and concerns before joining the trial?
Okay, so I've taken some notes as well in case I missed something. But basically, when I became diagnosed with TED, I just started researching standards of care, and I looked for new drug approvals. And I also knew that I could check clinical trial databases. There's a US and a European version, and that's sort of how I came across the trial. But the trial I was involved in, but then it's actually, that's just the first hurdle. Then I became really, really focused on how I could actually join the trial, because it's really hard to find a principal investigator. It's hard to find the company, the CRO that manages the trial. So I kind of went on a mission and spent quite a lot of time on that. I think in principle, I knew that the medication I found was a monoclonal antibody for the trial. I knew they were really well positioned in autoimmune disease, so it's not a new approach, it's just new in TED. And I mean, you are scared though, of course, like even I do have a lot of knowledge in the field, but I was still scared. But then, you know, you kind of have to look at the data and the information that's available and kind of work off that.
Right. So shall I move on to the second question then? So did you feel that you had enough information to make an informed decision, and were your questions answered and your concerns addressed throughout the trial?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I did a lot of secondary research, but I would also say when you come into the clinical setting, the teams are amazing. You know, you're presented with a lot of information. Really, the teams are very patient. They have a lot of time to take you through your questions, and you're essentially signing a contract, which is really, really detailed, right? Because it is a trial contract. So I felt very reassured. I felt very supported. And I also knew that, you know, I could leave the trial at any time. I think the bit that was a bit trickier and I didn't understand immediately was the kind of expenses that you referenced. So just make sure in addition to the kind of regulatory and clinical information, you also understand like what the expense budgets are, because it does affect your travel and where you stay when you take the medication on the trial.
Amazing, thank you. So I'm going to move on to the third question. So can you describe, you know, what it's actually really like, you know, taking part, you know, in a clinical trial? You know, how do you manage your life? Because, you know, all our patients are busy people, and you know, they're trying to juggle this on top of everything else. And you know, how do you manage holidays, your work commitments, and other things, you know, during the trial?
Well, I became, you know, severe in TED very, very quickly within 6 months. And I was about to change my job and take a new permanent role on. I had to cancel that. I had to literally cancel my career. So as such, I had a lot of time and I was mostly focused on trying to get treated. But I think the trial ran about 2 years, but the dosing was 1 year. So it was dosing every 6 weeks. So that's kind of manageable, I think. You do have to write off the full day. And yeah, and then I had the follow-ups, and I think you're treated really well. Like there's a clinical nurse who does the scheduling, like everybody's on top of everything. If you do need to change a date, there is some flexibility in that, you know, not massively, but you know, you can work around things, holidays that could taken into consideration. And of course, then you do have to sort of think about and know your side effects and the experience you're having. It's worth sort of noting that down. I also did a mini video diary in the beginning.
Yeah, I think that I absolutely agree that I encourage all my patients to keep a diary, because there's so many little things that, you know, when you come up for your trial visit, which is how have you been, and then you're kind of thinking back. So it's really helpful to just just have a list, and actually some of the trials actually have a patient diary as well. And of course, you know, we fully expect people to carry on living their lives, but it's just really we need notice, because us investigators also have leave and things like that. And all trials, they are very, very keen to always keep the same investigator for the same patient to make sure the measurements are consistent. So please, if you take part, do let us know your plans, and then we can generally accommodate. Okay. So the next thing is I'm going to ask, did you feel that you were supported when you had concerns, and has the trial changed your symptoms and your quality of life?
So first of all, I think anybody on a clinical trial will probably say they love the clinical research team, big fans. Like the kindness and the professionalism, and it's really a treat, to be honest. So absolutely love that. The trial was really amazing. I mean, you know, here I was not knowing if I could be able to continue my career because I am very client facing and public, and I looked really, really frightening. I just sort of, you know, the symptoms improved, my eyes went back into my head. I mean, it was really quite incredible, and my double vision, you know, disappeared. So it's just like I went from thinking my life was kind of over to having a lot of hope and feeling confident again and seeing the incremental benefit. And in my case also, I was, you know, worried about relapse. That can happen. So I sat out that period, but then have, you know, gradually re-entered my work life, feeling confident I'm going to be okay.
And how have you managed your side effects? Did you, you know, and did you find that you were supported, or you were able to manage them? And
well, actually, it's like there's obviously a list of there's a list of what the side effects will be, and they're listed in order of priority. So, i.e., what is the most common, and that is based on statistics. So you kind of track off that, and you kind of share that information, and then truthfully, it's also helpful to talk to other patients. And so if you know people are going through the same thing, you know, you just have to kind of grit your teeth and carry on.
okay, thank you. And how has being involved in the research affected your confidence and your understanding of TED? And also looking back, what would you say to someone who's thinking about going into a clinical trial?
Well, I mean, for me, I just sort of feel super informed about the illness. I know I've had the best sort of treatment of care. I'm really happy I was able to contribute, you know, a really rubbish situation turned into something positive where I could hopefully make a change for other patients in Europe. And I just feel confident again, and I'm, you know, not really worried about TED going forward. What was the question? What would you say to someone?
What would you say to someone who is thinking about joining a trial? What would be your advice from somebody who's been a trials participant?
I think like on a holistic basis, it is a way to contribute. You know, if we don't do trials, we can't get new drugs. And, you know, and especially female drugs are like, sorry, female illnesses are often overlooked and underfunded. So it's a way, female biased illnesses. So it's just, I just felt really positive to make a contribution, see it as something positive, see it as a way, as Vicky explained, as a way to access modern therapies that aren't often available in Europe's healthcare system. So, and also go to patient groups, I think, for information in clinical trial drug databases, if you don't have a practitioner you can speak to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Yvonne. So I'm going to stop sharing and
thank you very much, Yvonne and Vicky. That was, yeah, really generous of your information, actually, Yvonne, and sharing with us your experience, and really helpful to understand the support you received and the information that you got, and your tips, like understanding the expenses, but also being realistic about the time commitment, particularly with if people are working with the family, etc. And also engaging with the patient support groups who we know are here in the background and have organised the meeting today. And finally, I'd just like to say, I think it was really wonderful that you were able to talk about not just the personal effect of it, but also looking into the sort of the more holistic aspects and contributing to the future, which is generous, because not all drugs will produce positive outcomes. And I know we're all aware of that, but I think that was a lovely comment. So there have been some questions coming through in the chat, and we're now going to move on to the question and answer section for the whole of this session about new drugs and clinical trials. So please continue to share some of the questions in the Q&A, but I might just kick off, if I may, with it's come up quite a lot, both in the questions before and also on the chat, which is how do patients, how do they find out and how do they request to be part of a study of a new drug? Perhaps we could take all the panelists on this, but Colin, would you like to start with this and then move on to Vicky? Thank you, and then on to Yvonne.
I was going to volunteer Vicky actually for this one. But
it's a democracy. Vicky,
it's a democracy, yeah. I mean,
yes.
the place to start is usually, for most people who are under a thyroid eye disease clinic, is to ask what's happening there. But unfortunately, we don't quite have a registry across the country of trials. It's something I think we're trying to work towards, Vicky, to be able to allow more people to know. And especially if you're not under a specialist centre, you may know less about it. So it's probably worth getting in touch either through BTF or TED-CT, and maybe I'll pass over to Vicky as to other sources of finding out about trials if you're not at a major centre.
I think it will be really helpful if something like BTF can, if a data sharing allows, is to actually have a list of patients who are interested, and maybe it's something to think about going forwards. We created a generic thyroid eye disease trials email so that people who are interested can email in. In practice, it is a little bit more complicated because you need to obtain a GP referral to come, for example, if you want to come under my care for clinical trials, we do need a GP referral or consultant referral. So other consultants do refer to me in the Southeast, and some patients seek us out and try to, but they do need to have in practice a referral so that your care is transferred onto that hospital, because we just need to look after the patients holistically, and so that patient needs to be a registered patient at the facility where the trial is being run. But and also the difficulty is that trials open and shut at very short notice, and so any list that's compiled of current trials are often going to be out of date, whether they're recruiting or they finish recruitment and so on. So I think it's useful to keep talking to the clinicians who are looking after you, and maybe referencing the large centres that are often running clinical trials. I mean, the trials are not just run in London. A lot of the trials are run across the country in the large thyroid eye centres as well. So it's just worth asking more locally, so that not everybody has to come from Northern Ireland. Unfortunately, Northern Ireland, because it's not a big population, patients often have to travel to participate because a lot of the trials don't open there.
Thank you. And of course, highlighting the importance of the patient support groups, and particularly with the importance now, the recognition of patient and public involvement in research, that may increase awareness. But I think that's to be noted in the future. Yvonne, I know that you did extensive research and going on to the websites where you could see new drugs being developed both in the States and here. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, just that it would be, there is the clinical gov.org, and there's the EU version. Clinical trials have to be published. The data that's not always up to date, though, is the principal investigator. So Dr. Vicky Lee was my principal investigator. So I hit a lot of walls there. I tried to call the CRO, I tried to call Horizon at the time, and the reason I was actually living regionally in France and not getting very good support, it was desperation, really. I was just being told to stay patient as my eyes deteriorated. And actually my mum found Dr. Lee on a database, just a doctor's database, as a specialist in thyroid eye disease. And I literally fell into her office and went, "Do you know about this?"
Yeah.
She went,
Okay.
"Yes, I'm the principal investigator."
So distance and looking at some of the websites can be helpful as well. But maybe, and you were it's fair to say you were quite early in the journey of these, and I think now that we're really seeing this explosion. So hopefully this will improve. But many thanks.
There are many trials now. I was on the first trial, so yeah.
Can I just come back in to say, we need to do this matchmaking because the trials are desperate to recruit people.
Yes.
And people like Yvonne are sort of gold dust who are willing to put all that effort into it. So we're often sitting there thinking, I can't find any for the trials, and the companies are going. So if we can get a bit more matchmaking to happen, that would be great.
Yeah. So this meeting is hugely important and great to raise awareness and so much interest. I'm going to move, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to another question, which is important, which is that do any of these drugs that have been developed and maybe taken cross purposes from other illnesses, do any of those not just affect the thyroid eye disease, but also the thyroid itself or other aspects of Graves' disease, i.e., could someone's hyperthyroidism benefit from treatment of one of the thyroid eye disease drugs? Colin, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think that probably is my question, but from the endocrine side of things. So Yes and no. In other words, there are ones that don't, and there are ones that do. So the one that is most likely to come up first, we talked a little bit about the Tepezza, won't affect the Graves' disease because it only acts on those fibroblasts in the eye. It doesn't act on the thyroid. But the ones that begin to affect the antibodies, and I didn't talk about ones that can block those antibodies, they will begin to affect the Graves' disease. And that's fabulous because actually people stay on carbimazole for years, actually, and still in clinics. I've just actually been at a meeting this week in Oxford, which is looking at the new horizons in immune therapies. And people are really working hard to understand how we can control the immune system and switch it off selectively. So we can learn a lot from things like lupus erythematosus, other diseases. The one thing that I have to say about thyroid disease is there are some alternatives. If you have some of these nasty arthritises, you can't cut them out and, surgeon can't come and cut all your joints out. Whereas here they can remove the thyroid gland. So we've been at the back of the list up till now because the more aggressive therapies have been kept for other conditions. But as they get better and better, I think we're going to have more things that will actually hit the immune process selectively, like some of the ones I mentioned.
Thank you very much, Colin. So that was a very sensible question that came up in the chat. Another important aspect, and again, something that Vicky, that you touched on, and maybe you'd like to take this question, which is there always a placebo group? And could you explain about this more? And the question that the person asked was, does that mean that they may not improve on the drug? So I think there are two questions there. One is, do all experimental drugs necessarily improve things? And secondly, what about a placebo? And what happens if you receive the placebo?
Well,
Vicky.
the answer is we don't know, and that's why a clinical trial is being run. So we don't know whether the drug works at all. And I suppose the more late phase trials will have more evidence that there is some efficacy, but it may not work for that particular person. So that's the first thing, is that the clinical trial is being run to check whether it actually works and what the side effects are. And with the placebo group, you need to look at the trial design. So in the early phase trials, because we don't know whether it works, you always have to compare it either against standard treatment or no treatment. And a lot of the thyroid eye trials are designed against no treatment. So strangely enough, in most, there is some response in the placebo group when you look at most clinical trial data. But the main thing is to look at the difference between the group that is having the active drug and the person the group that's having the placebo drug. But myself as an investigator, I generally never know. I may suspect, but I never actually get confirmation who is having what. But as I mentioned earlier, there are some trial designs in which everybody gets active drug, but the dose of the drug is masked, and that's the masked element. So it's really choosing the trial to enter if you really are concerned about getting placebo. But the one thing that most sponsors have done to sweeten the trial design is to offer an open label extension. So if patients end up not responding because they either had placebo or they're not responding to the drug, they can actually have the real drug just after the initial sort of endpoint measurements. So the main thing is the devil is in the details. So that's why you need to look and ask the investigator about the trial design before making up your mind whether to join the trial or not.
Can I just add a little bit to that and then put a question to Yvonne, if I might, Helen? But yeah, it is important that we are able to have these placebo-controlled trials. But the question is, Yvonne, you took part in a trial, I think, that was placebo-controlled, and did you not know you
phase 3B 4/4. It was a post-marketing trial.
Okay. But would you have taken part in a study that had a placebo element? And what I was going to say, the bit I was going to add to what Vicky said is, you are very closely monitored in a clinical trial. So if you're deteriorating, you can exit the clinical trial because actually you've proven the point. And that often happens that the placebo people exit more early and then they get given alternative treatments. It doesn't stop you from getting alternative treatments if you're deteriorating. So it's not that we're going to watch bad things happen. Sorry, over to you, Yvonne, in terms of what you were.
So, I mean, it was very fortunate that I had a phase 3B, so I could look at so you have to do phase 3 trial to get a drug approved. So I was able to look at that data set, and then I joined the trial for the kind of larger arm where the FDA had requested, well, I didn't know which dose I'd get, for example. So that is, you know, a fairly well-checked trial, but it is an orphan disease, so not that many patients, if you compare it to, say, oncology, had taken it. But I would have absolutely joined a placebo arm as well, phase 2, because you've just got to do it to get the medication over the line. And I do agree with Vicky that there tend to be some sweeteners as well, where you hopefully eventually can get the therapy.
Thank you. I think it's important, though, Vicky, to emphasise that not all drugs, not all studies do have necessarily an open label arm. So that's something to find out. Secondly, Vicky, can I ask you to just answer two other points about the one is, do patients get to know whether they had the placebo or the active drug? If so, how soon? And second question is, what if there were to be, can you just say a little bit about if anyone developed a severe adverse event and how that's picked up and what might happen?
So the answer is generally we don't find out. The only times that I'm allowed to unmask is if someone has a severe adverse event, and that's probably life or limb threatening, that, you know, I need to go in and break the mask. And that's really quite uncommon, fortunately. So even if patients get hospitalized, the adverse event has to be reported, but, you know, unless it's really severe, that knowing which arm they're in is going to make a material difference to their treatment. We try not to break the mask. So that's the first thing. The second question is, if someone, you need to, you know, the main thing is to keep an open line to your to the trial team and actually communicate any concerns. I always joke that my trial coordinator, who's lovely, is like the father confessor. Everybody's emailing him everything that's happening in their lives, and he, being amazing, generally picks up, you know, what's important, and, you know, and actually passes on to me, because they are all trained research nurses, so they're extremely experienced. And the good thing is that, you know, having on the team, I have an endocrinologist and one of my co-investigators, so being an eyeball doctor, I can always revert to her wisdom as well, you know, to advise. So generally we're able to manage most advise and treat most adverse events inside the trial team. And of course, if I'm concerned, there is a medical monitor which is responsible for the entire trial, nominated by the sponsors. So I've communicated with the medical monitor, because they're the ones who know most about the drug, and we take their advice as well. So I think communication is key, really, to the safe running of any trial. But all patients are very closely monitored and encouraged to actually proactively report all symptoms.
Thank you, and I think that is really important, that actually you're more closely monitored, probably, to be fair, than you are in the standard clinic. But that should not
much more.
But that should not be your primary reason for taking part.
I mean, some people do that, because you'll get tested for lots of other things, for hepatitis, for liver, for kidney, and so on, that you wouldn't get otherwise. And a lot of people have said to me, I quite like that, like having a free check.
Reassuring, yeah. And then another question that's come up, and I think Vicky and Colin, you'll be both good at answering this, is there a list of thyroid, can patients get hold of a list of thyroid eye disease centres, perhaps if they're being seen in an area which we know perhaps isn't well served? And we know that from our survey as well that went out, that many patients have to travel a long way to be seen in a thyroid eye disease clinic, or indeed aren't even being seen in one. How can patients know where the nearest one is? Are they eligible to be referred to that? What's the process of doing that? Colin, do you want to go first, and then Vicky?
I was actually going to defer to Vicky on this, because she's done
great
work on it, particularly around the surgeons who are interested.
Yes.
I mean, we generally advise, and we've been trying to make it that in all the 16 regions of the UK, that there is a specialist centre, and it's not centrally commissioned, so it's not as if the government says there can only be one, it's going to be this. But we try and encourage that to happen. And Vicky's done some audits of some of those centres. So I'm going to just pass over to you, Vicky.
Yeah, so in my role as the British British Oculoplastic Surgery Society Thyroid Eye Lead, what I did was to compile a thyroid eye disease directory. So that's available on the British Oculoplastic Surgery Society bops.co.uk website. That actually all the centres report what they offer for thyroid eye disease, and that's, you know, anybody can log on to it and look up their nearest centre. to see, you know, where, you know, people who have an interest in thyroid eye, you know, with clinicians, you know, say their service offers. So that will be the first port of call, and you can find somewhere that's local to you and ask to be referred to that.
Thank you. And I think also that the patient support groups can also be helpful in terms of sharing that information. And of course, it's continually updated, but particularly relevant because we know that there are key standards that we should be, and there are lots of, they've been lots of advisory documents about how we should be managing patients with thyroid eye disease. And so it's really looking for a centre that does have expertise and the facilities to look after patients such as this. So I think we're at the end of our time for this session, and I'd just really like to thank all three speakers for really a very clear and I think enlightening session talking about the new drugs, but importantly how to get involved with all the new trials that are coming along to look into these. I'd like to thank Yvonne as well for sharing her personal experience, but also her really key advice that often we as clinicians may not be so aware of. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you patients for who were involved in the webinar for putting in such brilliant questions, which has allowed us to really explore some of the possibly more tricky and nuanced aspects of the clinical trials. So with that, I shall hand over to all of you to go on a quick comfort break, and then we will restart again at 12:15 talking about how we can all live better with thyroid eye disease. Many thanks indeed.